With that basic overview done, we are now ready to actually dive into building out the project, building out our dice roller. To get started, as a few house cleaning things, why don't we just delete all of this in our app.css file, except for this root tag, because that makes it look a little nicer. We could also set margin to 2 just so things get spaced. We can delete the index.css file, delete the ESLint config file. I'll talk about why in a second, and go from there. Also within here, we can delete the Feet logo, React logo, just make this one div tag and delete everything else in here. And now we are ready to start. So let's take a look at the finished project and think about what are the individual building blocks of this web page, because that's the real way that it makes sense to think within React. What are the building blocks that are repeated? What are the individual functional units? And how can we generally just organize things in a way that makes sense? So right off the bat, we have, a little bit of a sort of header area, and then the rest of it is more of the actual results. So you can think of it in terms of the dice roller and the roll results. Well, more like the place where we're going to create the dice and then where we're going to view the results of our dice roll. If we're breaking down the dice rolling even further, we can see that first off, we have some inputs for adding dice. Then we have a place where we're actually going to render a list of dice. So we have this exact same component repeated twice, just with different data for each dice. Finally, for the actual rolls, again, we have this component which is repeated for every single roll. So what we're going to do is we're going to break this down into 3 components. We're going to do the die input, the die view, and the results view. So let's scaffold this project. Also make sure we delete that so we don't get an error within main.tsx. It doesn't necessarily make sense to put these components anywhere. Typically, you want to create a specific components folder, which will house your various different components. You can then greater subdivide it into smaller folders if you have lots of related components. But if there's anything that you're going to be reusing, you can make a folder for it. So then we had our 3 different things we were going to create. We are going to create the die display, and we're going to say .tsx. We need to create the die input .tsx, and we need to create the die display .tsx. I already did die display. Need to create die result. Die result. That's what I meant. Or you could even call it roll result.tsx, right? Because the result of dice is the roll. And then the other sort of headers and whatnot, we can probably just have within the app.tsx file. So now let's create our first React component. A React component has a couple rules that it has to follow, which are demonstrated in our app.tsx file already. First off is it has to have a capital letter. The reason being that helps React distinguish between what should be a component and what is a built-in HTML tag. Moreover, what it returns has to be a single element, which has all of the children wrapped in it. For instance, this is just a single div, But as we saw earlier, all of the content of the component was wrapped from this single parent tag. If I was to try and put a paragraph up here, we would get an error. Everything has to be nested under a single parent component. Most of the time, that's just a parent div. So let's try it. Let's go to die input, and we can declare a function. We can say export const die input. For now, we aren't going to pass anything into it. And hopefully, this syntax should look pretty similar, right? It is just the arrow syntax for a JavaScript function. Now we can just return an h1 tag and say input die. Now, as you see, we use this keyword export. What that means is that this component can be then imported into a different file. You can also export other things besides React components. If I had some kind of constant or some kind of variable that I wanted to use other places, I could also export that. But for now, we're just exporting this die input. Then in our app.tsx, we can import that component. We say import die input. Here our sort of IntelliSense is filling it out for us, but I'm just going to show you how you could do that if you weren't using it or if it wasn't working correctly. So die input is the name of the component. Then you say from, and then where within your project it is coming from. You can say dot slash to escape your current folder. So here we're inside the source folder. If we want to escape the folder and go up a level, we would use dot slash. And as you can see, it's showing us all of the things that are above the source folder. If we want to stay within the source folder, we can say just dot slash, and then we see all of the possibilities within the source folder, dot slash components slash die input, like so. Then we can render that die input. And again, we could have it as an opening tag and a closing tag, but since we aren't passing anything to it, we can just have it be one self-contained tag. Restart the project, and then once we have it running, we can see we have our component that we used up here, and then the rest of our project, which we have below it, just like so. One other quick point with imports is there are actually two types of imports you can do in React and JavaScript generally. You can do default imports and normal imports. If we look at the current file we're in, we say export default app, and then when we import it in main.tsx, we just have to say import app. However, if you don't have a default export, in this case, we just say that we're exporting the die input, but it's not the default import. Sorry, it's not the default export. Then when you import it, you have to use this curly brackets notation because you could have multiple exports from the same file. So if we were to, for example, export const hello would just be some string. Then we could import die input and also import the string hello as well. You can only have one default export per file. And generally, unless you are importing the default import from some library, when you're just writing your own components, you normally don't want to use default exports because then every single time you're trying to import something, you have to consciously think, oh, is this the default export or is this a normal export? So it's normally better to just stick to normal exports. In addition to scaffolding our components, we should also scaffold the types that we're going to need for this project. we're going to reuse the same types that we're going to use to describe our data in multiple different places. So it makes sense to centralize them unless it's a type that we're only going to use in one file. To do this, you can create a folder, and in this case, we'll say dicetypes.ts. And then if you, for example, had a more complicated project, you could, organize your types however you think makes sense. If we look back at the final project and what the information we need to represent a die, all we need is a name and a number of sides. So, for example, the name. And then after we roll it, we have the name, number of sides, and name, number of sides, and the actual result of the roll. So if you want to try this yourself, you can try defining those two types, a die type and a die result type, and I will do it in 1 second. So for the die type, all you need to do is say name is going to be a string and sides is going to be a number. Oops. Then the die result, we want to extend the die type. So die result equals die and result, which will be a number. Now we can export both of these types, which we will use later. Then when we actually want to import a specific type, you can be a little more explicit that the thing you're importing is only going to be a type and is not a value, such that when your code is getting compiled and outputted, that import statement can kind of just be ignored. So we could say import type die from types dice types. Final super quick thing is create a temporary data.ts file, which will represent data that the user would input. We will be creating the actual interactivity in the next lecture, so we just need some sample data for this lecture. You can either create something like this, create a couple die and a couple die results, or link in the description, you can just copy and paste this gist like so, and you are now ready to go.